Have we arrived on this planet by accident? Or do our lives have some inbuilt purpose? For centuries, religion mapped a pathway to truth. But that was before science challenged God. Today, many people are caught in a divide, distrustful of science or religion, or both. For religious believers, science can seem to threaten God's existence. For atheism, it's time to awake from religion's dream. But some scientists believe truth can be found both in the cathedral and the lab. So can they do this without compromising their science or their beliefs? Can God survive in the age of the quark and the gluon? Or is faith now being tested to breaking point?
At the end of the day, scientists are interested in truth. We're interested in the right answer. We're not interested in pursuing the wrong answer, because what good is that?
At the deepest level, the debate between science and religion is really a debate about how do I obtain reliable knowledge about the world? How do I know that something is true, or how do I know that something is false? Or how do I know that something is reliable, something is unreliable? And that's a terribly important question.
The world divides into two classes. People who think that why is there something rather than nothing is a very deep question, and those who can't see the point of the question. I think why there's something rather than nothing is an important question, and God provides to me the most satisfying answer.
We all try to make sense of our worlds. But how do we know what we know?
I think a lot of people don't live their lives very thoughtfully at all. I mean, everyone's a philosopher in one way or the other. It means they have their own little philosophy, their own theology of what's important, what's not. But a lot of people, they pick up ideas from school, from their parents, from TV, from what they read in a magazine, and they kind of have this patchwork idea of what's true and what's right, wrong, what's important, what's not important. And they live these kind of unexamined lives. And so what the science-religion debate helps people do is think, hey, why do I do what I do? Why do I believe in God? Why do I not believe in God? Is it because I was just brought up that way? Or is it because I've really thought about these issues carefully and objectively?
Behind the science-religion debate lie challenging questions. What is the nature of our world? How did life come into being? And, most importantly, is the universe pointless, or is there some purpose to it? Today, many people claim that science and faith are at odds. But experts in the two fields say history reveals a very different picture. Professor Peter Harrison has spent his career studying the development of modern science. He's found that science grew from theological roots.
Perhaps science wouldn't have emerged in the West at all had it not been for a certain set of religious convictions about how the world was. That, for example, the world was governed by a rational lawmaker, a deity who had put in place mathematical laws, and this ensured the regularity of the world. So the very idea that the world is a place that is rationally intelligible springs from, or at least for these people, it sprang from the idea that there was a God who had put this order in place.
Any way of looking at the world has to be surrounded by a series of underlying assumptions which you must take for granted. They themselves are not open to proof. You have to proceed, in a sense, on trust. And that's what people broadly refer to in part as metaphysics. And to begin with, it's sometimes forgotten that science has to have some sort of metaphysic. And it might be a metaphysics which is actually, from my perspective, rather uninteresting. It's a nihilistic one, which would say it's either completely random or it's completely meaningless or everything came about by chance. But on the other hand, you are certainly invited to consider alternative metaphysics, which again, from my perspective as a Christian, would be regarded as unacceptable by my materialist colleagues. But nevertheless, I would say we have a series of interactions here. We have a series of deeper possibilities.
Does science then have its own unspoken assumptions? Today, science is often used to bolster atheism. But modern science actually emerged out of Christian Europe. So what brought us to where we are today? Peter Harrison claims a British biologist has been instrumental in driving a wedge between science and religion.
What Thomas Huxley saw in Darwinism was the potential to make biology scientific and to give it a significant public profile and to make science something that was important in society in a way in which it wasn't. And part of that meant, in a sense, prizing science from the hands of the clergy who, for various reasons, had tended to dominate scientific positions and the scientific establishment for quite a long time. The strategy he used, we might call it a kind of wedge strategy, was to say, actually, science and religion are different activities, they're in conflict. Clergy, hands off the sciences, leave it to the true professional.
Sir John Polkinghorne has refused to be hands-off with science. Formerly a top particle physicist at Cambridge University, he left his academic post in mid-career to be ordained in the Anglican Church. Today, he's regarded as a world authority on both religion and science. He maintains they share a common goal.
They're both concerned with the search for truth, obviously for different aspects of truth, but those aspects have to fit together in some sort of way. We're very familiar with that sort of fact. The kettle's boiling because burning gas heats the water. The kettle's boiling because I want to make a cup of tea. Would you like to have one? We don't have to choose between those two. In fact, if we're to understand the mysterious event of the boiling kettle, we need both those forms of explanation. Similarly, I think science tells us how the world works, but religion tells us there is a meaning and purpose, something being fulfilled in the unfolding of the history of the world. So I need both those perspectives if I'm truly to understand the really rich and remarkable world in which we live.
For John Polkinghorne, the believer, God created the universe. But in talking about that universe, he sounds strangely like a scientist.
We have very good scientific reason to believe that the universe as we observe it today started about 14 billion years ago in a very hot, very dense, very concentrated state, and it's expanded and it's also complexified. It started very simple, just a ball of energy. Now it's the home of saints and scientists. That's a remarkable sort of story, and we've been able to figure out from science a good many of the steps in that story. There are things that we're not sure about, and in particular we've discovered recently that there's more in the universe than we can actually see. In fact, the matter we can see or whose effects are discernible directly by us is only a very small percentage of what's going on. There's a lot of dark matter in the universe, whose nature we don't know. And moreover, there is something called dark energy, which is an energy associated with space itself, which in fact is driving the expansion of the universe, and whose origin and nature is so far mysterious, but it's certainly there. So there are lots of interesting questions still waiting. That's the thing about science. Every time you turn around a corner, there's something awaiting you which you hadn't expected.
And so one of the most amazing things about the universe is that it's intelligible, that we can understand something about it. And I think that's because there's intelligence behind it.
Dr. Ard Louis is a theoretical physicist. But can a scientist who speaks of intelligence behind the universe be a true scientist?
When I first really realized this was when I was in my 4th year as an undergraduate taking an advanced quantum mechanics course. And there's a really amazing story. It starts in 1928 with Paul Dirac in Cambridge. And so he asked a really simple question. What if I take this Schrödinger equation for things that are really small and combine it with the special relativity, Einstein's theory about things that go really fast? Can I put them two together? And the only way that it works, that mathematically you can reconcile these two in a mathematically consistent way, is by postulating something called antimatter, which is the opposite of matter. Now that's a really crazy idea. Nobody would have thought of antimatter on their own. It's just too crazy to imagine, even in science fiction. But amazingly, the mathematics that Dirac put together, putting things that are really small and things really fast together, forces this on you.
Astonishingly, 4 years later in 1932, scientists discovered antimatter, confirming Dirac's calculation. For physicists, this points to a mathematical order behind our universe. For Ard Louis, it goes further than that.
To me, that was like, still when I talk about it, sometimes I get goosebumps thinking how beautiful that is, how amazing that something like that could work. You take one theory, an unrelated theory, you put them together, and out comes something that nobody could have predicted in their wildest dreams. That's just astounding, almost miraculous. And it's hard to look at something like that and not ask yourself, why is it that way? Who put it that way? Who did it? It's like there's a big clue right there in your face.
This mathematical order, for some then, implies design and purpose to our universe. But is a designer really required by science? Hasn't the Big Bang done away with the need for a creator? Dr. David Wilkinson is a theologian, but he trained as an astrophysicist.
I remember in the early days of being a student in physics, and I thought it was a pretty good argument to say, if the universe began with a Big Bang, then who lit the blue touch paper? That must be God, mustn't it? And I thought that was a pretty good argument indeed, until I read Stephen Hawking. And Stephen Hawking, in A Brief History of Time, gives an explanation for the very first moment of the universe. It's a speculative explanation, but it's a possible explanation. And I remember being quite shocked by this and wondering, really, can I believe in a creator God, or is a creator God redundant?
So what precisely has science revealed about how our universe began?
Science has got back to a very, very tiny fraction of 1 second after the Big Bang. And really that's a remarkable achievement, but I think it's dangerous for anyone to say, this is how it was before the Big Bang. The nature of the Big Bang is such that we can't actually observe the way the universe was prior to the Big Bang. We can't know. So no more can we say, before the Big Bang this was happening, or before the Big Bang there was a creator God. It is outside physics, it is outside science to say, this is what it was like before the Big Bang. And that's not to say that it's wrong to hypothesize or that it's wrong to speculate, but simply to say it's not actually science.
The Big Bang, then, offers no answers to the question of a creator. And Professor Catherine Blundell maintains science hasn't undermined God. But she also refuses to prove God using gaps in science's understanding.
If you say, well, science answers this much about the way the universe is, but science doesn't answer this aspect of the universe's characteristics, and then to invoke God and to allow God to reside in that gap in our knowledge, that's dangerous, because when a clever scientist comes along, that gap will be filled by a deeper and richer scientific understanding. So then, where you posit that God is allowed to reside gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is a practice known as God of the gaps, and it's dangerous.
Once, believers pushed God into these gaps. Today, religion uses mystery as evidence for God at its peril. But is there any scientific basis for thinking our universe may have been created with purpose? John Polkinghorne worked alongside an astronomer who made a critical discovery that shook his beliefs.
One of the great triumphs of astrophysics in the second half of the 20th century was to figure out how the elements are made. Because the very early universe is very simple, it only makes very simple elements. In fact, hydrogen and helium, the two simplest elements, and you can't really do very much with them. They have very boring chemistry. You need much more elements if you're going to have something as interesting as life, and in particular you need carbon. The chemistry of life is the chemistry of carbon. So where does carbon come from? There's only one place in the whole universe where carbon is made. It's made in the interior nuclear furnaces of the stars. Every atom of carbon in our bodies was once inside a star. We're people of stardust. Now, how that happened was figured out in Cambridge. Fred Hoyle, a senior colleague of mine, was one of the leading figures in this, and they were trying to figure out how carbon was made. They had helium, and if they could make 3 heliums stick together, that would make carbon. But they couldn't figure out how to do that. To get 3 small things like that to stick together at once, you can't do it. Okay, say we do it bit by bit, make 2 stick together, that makes beryllium, stays around a bit, another one comes along, makes carbon. But it doesn't work because beryllium is very, very unstable. It just disappears like that. So they were stuck. And then Fred had a good idea, and he said, it'll just go if there is something called a resonance, a very enhanced effect, which is just at the right energy in carbon to make that extra one stick on much, much more quickly than you would have thought. So he was very pleased with himself. We went off the nuclear data tables just to check that this resonance, this effect, was there, and it wasn't. And so Fred was a very stubborn, persistent friend. He rang up some friends in the States and said, look, you've missed something in carbon. There's a resonance there that you haven't spotted, but I know exactly where it is because you had to have this energy. And they were apparently a bit reluctant to look, but in the end they went and looked and they found it. That's a wonderful scientific story. But also it struck Fred that it's more than a scientific story, because of course if the laws of nuclear physics had been a tiny bit different, either there would be no resonance at all, or it would be some other energy which would be no good. And Fred, who had a lifelong commitment to atheism, is reported to have said, in the Yorkshire accent, beyond my powers to imitate, the universe is a put-up job. In other words, this can't be just a happy accident. This is too significant for that. There must be something behind all this. Because Fred didn't like the word God, he says some capital I intelligence has monkeyed with the laws of the universe.
Observing the universe, then, can spring riddles for atheism too. Hoyle's groundbreaking discovery led to what subsequently became known as the Theanthropic Principle. According to this, precise physical laws hold our universe in exquisite balance. Our universe appears to be wildly improbable.
The laws of nature have certain constants, and it's not clear why those constants have the values that they do, but it is clear that you can change those constants a little bit, and you would have a universe that's no longer fertile for life. You'd have basically a sterile universe. And one very famous example is you change some of the electromagnetic constants a little bit, and the sun, as you know, it would blow up. Okay, there'd be no Earth.
But our universe is very particular, very special in its character. There's a sense in which the universe was pregnant with life, essentially from the Big Bang onwards, because the very given physical fabric of the world, the laws of nature that science assumes that's not explained, had to take a very precise, very finely tuned form for carbon-based life to be possible.
So is this science finally pointing to a purposeful universe and to God? Or is there a danger of religion trying to force science's hand?
I think it's fair to say that nothing that we observe in nature, for example, its regularity, or indeed these remarkable anthropic phenomena, prove that there is a God. But the really important point is they are absolutely consistent with belief in God. And therefore I'd like to suggest that we don't think about nature proving that there is a God. That's how an earlier generation might have approached this. For me, the really important thing is that the world as we observe it corresponds with what Christians would say the world ought to be like. That there's a correspondence between the theory and the observation.
But if the improbability of our universe is no final proof of God, it continues to represent an embarrassment to atheism. And it's here that atheism today is looking for an ally in cutting-edge science. Once our universe was seen as unique, but contemporary cosmology is now opening up very different possibilities. What if we live in a multiverse? What if our universe is just one of many? The Theanthropic Principle implied a religious question. How can our universe be so improbably fruitful for life? A multiverse now seems to provide the materialist answer. After all, why can't ours be the universe with the winning ticket for life in a lottery of millions?
Multiverse is a concept that maybe our universe that began, as we believe now, with an energetic beginning that's sometimes referred to as a Big Bang, but the universe that we know of that's been around for 13.7 billion years might not be the only universe, and in fact there are other universes that have perhaps had starts and perhaps have had ends. Maybe they've cycled, maybe there are many parallel universes. There are many different theories of what a multiverse might look like.
So is our universe just a random grain of sand in infinite space? Dr. Jennifer Wiseman is a NASA astronomer who studies the formation of stars. As a believing scientist, what does it mean for her if our universe is just one of many?
I think the simple answer to that is, so what? If we found out that there are many, we now know that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, and that's just made God ever so much more great. So having multiple universes, again, would simply say that, wow, the God that we worship is ever more great.
The multiverse is a very uneconomic form of metaphysical speculation. I prefer the theistic metaphysics, which says that there's probably just one universe, which is the way it is, because it's not any old world, but a world that God has endowed with just those properties, able to have a fruitful history. But having said that, I'd also want to add a theological caveat that it's not for me to limit the creative generosity of God. And if God wants to create a number of other universes, then God, in my view, is free to do so.
My scientific prejudices means that I think other universes are probably there, and I don't have a worry about that as a Christian. After all, God is a God who created 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies. That's a pretty big place. Adding on a few million universes doesn't create any new theological problems for that.
The idea of a multiverse, then, provides no religious threat to these believers. Science is also unable to prove the existence of other universes. By a curious irony, then, science here enters the same realm as faith.
Just as it's wrong to have a God of the gaps, I think we ought to proceed with equal caution, lest we have a multiverse of the gaps, and simply invoke something that similarly isn't very testable, isn't very observable, isn't measurable, and plonk that into our gap in our understanding.
Contemporary cosmologists, in a sense, ask questions that are most like religious questions. They're legitimate questions, but they're questions that go well beyond the bounds of what we can actually establish.
The 18th century philosopher Leibniz asked, why is there something rather than nothing? Science has described how our universe began with stunning success. But 3 centuries later, science is still unable to answer Leibniz's question.
The scientific understanding of the Big Bang tells us a lot. It tells us about the dynamics and the contents and the evolution of the universe as it was at early times and as it's evolving into now. But science and our detailed scientific understanding of the Big Bang doesn't actually address the question of meaning. That's not science. Doesn't mean it's untrue, but it is different from science. And that's where bringing in other truths about the reality of human existence comes in.
We can describe the age of the universe, we can describe how stars and galaxies have evolved over time, we can describe all these things, but we can't answer why is there a universe at all? And why is there a universe that would evolve toward the point of having human beings that are having the kind of conversation we're having right now? Why are there concepts of hatred and love, and why do people do things to each other that don't promulgate natural selection or survival of species that make no sense? Why a lot of things just aren't answered through science, and I think most people, both Christian and non-Christian, are grateful for that, because there's a lot of interesting things about life that don't have to do with measuring physical forces of nature.
These scientist believers, then, say science must acknowledge its limits. But they also say faith must be consistent with what we know through science, rather than being based in what we don't know. For them, a God of the universe could hardly be threatened by any advances in human knowledge.
That's why I think it's exciting as Christians to go exploring, because we're never going to find anything that's outside of God's realm. Everything is part of this majestic creation, and the more you discover, the more amazed you get by thinking about God. And so I think exploration is a divinely Christian activity, and people should be excited about it.
But where our universe came from is only one of science's stories. Another is the story of how life itself began. And that's a story told through Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. A story starting not in a biblical garden, but in apparent chaos. So can believing biologists make sense of the claim that we're the created children of God? Or does that biblical account now lie in ruins?